You are listening to Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. My name is Brendan Cooney.
And I'm Andrew Kleiman.
On today's episode, we bring you part 2 of our conversation and debate with Ben Burgis about Marxist theory of exploitation and whether one can jettison a theory of value and still preserve the key aspects of the theory of exploitation. To hear more episodes of Radio Free Humanity, to read more about the issues discussed, or to join in the conversation, please visit Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org. You can also make a donation to the podcast there on the website. While our podcast is hosted by MHI, the views expressed by the co-hosts and guests of Radio Free Humanity are their own. They do not necessarily reflect the views and positions of MHI. In just a moment, we will begin that interview with Ben Burgis, but first, as we do in every episode, a few minutes to talk about some current events. Today is Wednesday, June 23rd, and we're going to be talking about a piece in Current Affairs by Nathan Robinson called How to End Up Serving the Right. It is a exploration of the downward political trajectory of Matt Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald as they've spiraled further into becoming sort of puppets of right-wing talking points. So, Andrew, we've talked about Greenwald and Taibbi, or we've talked about Greenwald at least before, and his strong turn to the right. Were there new things in this piece, new things you got out of this piece by Robinson?
No, I was very happy to see the piece because Robinson, he's a socialist. He is not like affiliated as strongly as we are with the people on the left who, reject the Greenwald stuff and the whole anti-neoliberal line. He's kind of, traditionally been somewhere in the middle. And to come out strongly against them, I think is good. And it kind of signals that, my God, everybody realizes that those people have crossed to the other side. What's hard for me to understand, I think it's hard for you to understand, is like what took you so long. But I mean, for instance, Robinson says, one of the first signs I had that something distinctly odd was happening to him, Greenwald, came during an exchange we had about the killing of a young black man by a police officer. This was in September of 2020.
It took him a while to figure out what was going on with Greenwald.
Yeah, I mean, did it really take you till 2020, to September of 2020, to figure out what was wrong with Greenwald? I don't think that that's what he means. I mean, in terms of serving the right, I was just, doing some history to see if I gotten things wrong. And there was a piece in Vox from September 15, 2016, Jeff Stein, entitled Why Glenn Greenwald Relentlessly Attacks Hillary Clinton Even If It Helps Donald Trump. I mean, this was already relentless, and it was already a thing. It was already, a topic for a whole longish article way back then, in the collusion with Assange and Assange's collusion with the Putin government. And I mean, all of this was out there and known way long time ago.
Well, one of the things I thought was interesting about the Robinson piece was that he does a lot of counter-arguing or debunking this narrative that we get from people like Greenwald and Taibbi, that one of the main enemies that the left needs to fight, or free thinkers need to fight, is this woke authoritarianism, cancel culture, this sense that there's mass hysteria and repression going on in the name of Me Too and Black Lives Matter and such. And we've talked about the anti-neoliberal sentiments that have given rise to some of these red-brown politics amongst people like Taibbi and Greenwald, but we haven't dealt as much with to use the term, anti-woke sentiments. So I thought that might be interesting for us to delve into a little bit. One of the things he does that's, I thought, useful was just to say, look, this characterization of woke authoritarianism throws a lot of different things into the same label, and is really not that accurate or useful, because you're dealing with maybe some overly zealous Twitterati, but you're also, lumping in with that very legitimate and anti-racist and anti-sexist movements that are a major force for social change in our country. And by grouping all that together you make like very reactionary arguments.
I think that was like one of Robinson's main points, is that Taibbi and Greenwald are basically becoming, whether they know it or not, becoming mouthpieces for the far right, because they're just adopting the same kind of set of talking points. And yeah, I mean, this is just a grab bag of every resentment and every complaint in the culture wars. He's absolutely right about that. There's no commonality to anything that they're talking about. I mean, woke culture. I mean, the people who are in charge of Dr. Seuss's estate decide not to publish books with racist cartoons, and that's like woke culture, or woke politics, whatever it is. It's like, so what? You're going to blame that on what? BLM? You're going to blame that on the left? I mean, the whole thing is nuts if you try to like deconstruct it factually. None of the stuff coming from the right is meant to be factual. It's identitarian politics, or identity politics. It's all about white rural male Christian identity. Even the term woke. I mean, using the term woke disparagingly is because it's a black term. Using it disparagingly is racist.
He also, talks a little bit about the seductiveness of this right-wing form of argument in which things really can, at first glance, sound like a very factual, politically neutral observation, but in fact are like really decontextualized. You were brought up earlier Greenwald's reaction to this police shooting, where Greenwald basically said that people were throwing out due process by condemning the police officers before they had a chance to be tried, right?
Yeah, the ACLU, or somebody at the ACLU, tweeted that the person was murdered by the cops.
And Greenwald got all critical of the ACLU, saying, look, they were supposed to be for rule of law and due process, and they're trying these people in the court of public opinion. Robinson rightly points out that, look, these things are necessary when there is a complete breakdown of the rule of law when it comes to police officers, and they're not ever held accountable to for people they kill.
Yeah, I mean, what kind of due process did this dead person get? Right, so he's saying, you care about due process and rights. What about the rights of the victim of the cops? Keeping in mind, among other things, that the cops are a governmental institution. What about the rights of individuals against the government? Especially because the cops can murder people and it doesn't get called murder because they're allowed to do it.
And that's such a right-wing type of argument where at first glance seems logical. Oh, they're not in favor of due process, but it completely decontextualizes the entire politics of policing in the country.
Greenwald this is his specialty, is decontextualizing.
Yeah.
He finds some thing that's not 100% perfectly accurate, and he pulls on it and pulls on it and pulls on it and makes that the issue, so that you forget about what the real issue is. I mean, and Robinson has an example of that. There's millions of Greenwald examples of that. He did that always with regard to the collusion issue. Greenwald knows he's doing this, right? Everybody knows that Greenwald is doing this. Okay, everybody knows that the right wing is just spinning these stories to whip up the grievances of its base, the Trumpite base, and that they don't care about factual accuracy. And what it looks like to me is he's just a master, and he's long been a master of nitpicking in a very biased, one-sided way. He hates the liberals, he hates the Democratic establishment, he hates the mainstream media, and everything he does is to hurt them and to help their enemies.
Well, that's all the time we have for this current events section. Up next, our conversation with Ben Burgis. So this is part 2 of our conversation with Ben Burgis about Marxist theory of exploitation and whether or not, as Ben claims, that theory does not require a theory of value to be valid. We're going to be talking a lot in this interview about a paper from several decades ago by G.A. Cohen entitled The Labor Theory of Value and the Concept of Exploitation. If you didn't catch part 1 of our interview, you should probably go to listen to that first and then come back. Ben Burgis is the author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. He has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Miami. He His academic specialization has to do with logical paradoxes about self-reference, but these days he spends most of his time exposing the logical fallacies of right-wing reactionaries and technocratic centrists and arguing for democratic socialism. He writes a column for Jacobin and hosts a podcast and YouTube show called Give Them an Argument. So welcome again to the podcast, Ben.
Welcome, Ben.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
So the worker is the only person who creates it, and by it, he means the product. So the worker is the only person who creates the product, and thus the only person who has a right to it, and by extension, a right to its value. That's the way that Ben phrases the argument in a piece he wrote on Medium. He credits that argument to G.A. Cohen, and we want to talk about that argument now.
I think that what Ben actually wants to do is give a short summary of the gist of Cohen's argument. But my problem with that short version is it runs afoul of so-called Hume's law, which I know Ben endorses because he has a big chunk of his book about this. Hume, David Hume, the Scottish philosopher from way back, said you can't derive an ought from an is. You cannot derive normative conclusions from a positive statement of fact. It seems to me that that's exactly what's going on. The worker is the only person who creates the product, factual statement, and thus the only person who has a right to it. That's a normative conclusion.
Certainly, I think you're right that, as stated, taken literally, that the thus doesn't follow from the part before it. But I think, it's an enthymeme. It's an argument where not all of the, the assumptions are explicitly stated, which I think is pretty common for this kind of thing. Technically speaking, the second part doesn't follow from the first part by itself. That's because, as is very often the case when we're making arguments like that, there's an appeal to implicit, normative premises. Hume's point isn't that factual premises do no work whatsoever in securing normative conclusions. It's just that factual premises by themselves can't get us to normative conclusions. So in this case, I agree, you have to do more work to figure out whether, given that workers are the only humans that would have rights who are involved in the generation of products, that, that gives the workers a right to the product of their labor.
So I take it we're in agreement that your real argument is Cohen's plain argument.
Yeah. No, that's right.
Okay.
Yes, let's get into Cohen and the plain argument.
It's somewhat of a better argument than the stripped down two-line version that Ben put out there, but I think it's a terrible argument, Cohen's plain argument. And I want to say, Cohen nowhere in that essay endorses the plain argument. And as I read it, he doesn't think much of it. He ends his essay by saying, it does not follow that the plain argument suitably expanded is a good argument. Having disposed of blah, 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 I hope to provide an evaluation of the plain argument elsewhere. I've tried to track down his evaluation elsewhere. I never found it. But it's pretty clear to me he was questioning how good the argument was. So what I think he was doing is saying, this is how your generic garden variety Marxist actually thinks when they're endorsing what they think of as Marxist theory. And they're not really endorsing Marxist theory. The plain Marxist, kind of thinks this way. And so he was putting out, I think, what he thought was the underlying thinking of garden variety Marxism, or generic Marxism. But I think the argument is a very bad argument. One issue is that it equivocates. Cohen begins, the laborer is the only person who creates the product, that which has value. That's fine because he made it true by definition, because anybody who creates the product in whatever sense of creates the product you want, he calls a laborer. So it becomes true by definition. He says that. That's fine. But then he moves to, the laborer receives less value than the value of what he creates. And that's, I think, extremely problematic, because the laborer is the only person who creates, kind of by definition here. But that does not mean that the entire product is only the creation of the worker's labor. Okay? Besides the worker's labor, there are, in terms of physical production, a lot of other things that are involved in the creation of the product. Machines create the product. Electricity creates the product. Paper clips, all of those things are involved in the production, or you could call it creation of the product. So yes, the worker is the only person, but worker and raw materials and so forth and so on, all of those things are involved in the creation of the product. I don't think this is a small matter when we get to the economic debates that are conducted on this basis about the suppliers of various inputs. Are they getting the contribution of their inputs back? What neoclassical economists call the value of the marginal product of their inputs. The neoclassical economists say if we had perfect competition, then in a state of general equilibrium, the supplier of each productive input, including the supplier of labor, the worker, they would all receive payments equal to the value of the marginal product of their input. None of them would receive the whole product, not the supplier of labor, not the supplier of paper clips, not the supplier of machines, but added up all together, all of their payments correlated to the contributions of those inputs. The sum of all of those payments would exhaust the value of the product, so there would not be any exploitation, according to neoclassical theory. And I don't think that the plain argument can deal with that, because it basically is a trick to move from the worker being the only person who creates to the worker's labor being the only thing that creates. The first thing is true. The laborer is the only person who creates, but the creation of the product is not due purely and exclusively to the worker's labor. There are other inputs involved.
Yeah, so I guess I just want to say on the first part of that about Cohen's tentativeness, I think that this might just be, I think a lot of analytic philosophy papers, kind of feel like that at the end, where especially when people are making major claims within papers, there's a certain kind of style of philosophy where I think that that's kind of level of tentativeness that I know would read strangely in other contexts is fairly common. I think I would read that part a little bit differently, but on the argument itself, I don't agree that there is equivocation there, because as far as like the more important point, about the argument from neoclassical economics, I've always thought that the best response to this was it's the early chapters of David Schweikart's book, After Capitalism, where he talks about people who will frame this argument in terms of land, labor, and capital. And I think it's particularly sort of sharply put, when you think to the land question, because it's like, well, wait a second, what does that mean to give the full sort of marginal contribution of the land back? I mean, are we burning a sacrifice to the god of land here? Well, no, of course, what you're doing is you're compensating the owner of the land, but that's a very different thing. Saying that the land is making this contribution is a very different thing from saying that the owner of the land is somehow making some sort of contribution to the generation of that value. And the same point even applies for industrial machinery. This is Richard Wolff's formulation about how, yes, sure, the worker didn't build the factory, but neither typically did the owner. That the owner is a middleman between a group of workers who built the factory and a group of workers who are going to work there. And the two groups of workers, collectively are making all of the contributions made by human beings, other than any that a capitalist might happen to make if they're not hiring somebody to make it, either in a managerial or a menial capacity, which for reasons we went over, I think is beside the point. So I don't agree that there's an equivocation here.
The issue is not, do these other people create? Okay, but by definition they don't create. Okay, we can argue. Okay, but I could stipulate labor is the only person who creates, and the supplier of paper clips does not, the supplier of machines does not, the supplier of electricity does not. Okay, but still the argument, the conclusion does not go through once you recognize that the worker is not the only creator, that there are these other inputs, machines, electricity, and so forth. The labor is the only person who creates. The labor receives less value than the value of what he creates, which is to say the supplier of labor receives less value than the whole. The supplier of machines receives less value than the whole. The supplier of electricity receives less value than the whole. The supplier of paper clips receives less value than the whole. And therefore, the labor is exploited by the capitalist. The supplier of machinery is exploited by the capitalist. The supplier of paper clips is exploited by the capitalist. The conclusion just does not go through.
So first of all, I think the conclusion does go through. I don't think there's an equivocation here. I think we can paraphrase so that line 18, the labor receives less value than the value of what he creates. We can paraphrase it to match the phrasing as the labor receives less value than the value of what the labor is the only person that creates, and it doesn't impact the argument in any way. So I don't think there's an equivocation there. I think there is an equivocation when you start talking about the supplier. Who is the supplier of the paper clips? Are we talking about the owner of the paperclip company, or are we talking about the workers who created the paper clips? That difference is going to matter an awful lot.
The problem is this is not in the plain argument. Once you pack a certain moral theory, into the premises that precede, then of course you can get the conclusion.
Well, but
it's not there in the plain argument.
Okay. Well, I think that if you want to say that there's some equivocation here that wrecks the argument, I think that you have to say, why it is that, the argument would seem any less plausible or different, if we rephrased 18 to the labor receives less value than the value of what he is the only person who creates, which I think, yes, Cohen slips and he uses different phrasing in the two premises, but I don't think anything hangs on that.
Well, because the problem is, to say he creates it makes it seem like he alone creates it and nothing else creates it. And the moment you say he receives less value than the value of what he is the only person who creates, whereas there are other things that also create, at that moment, the fact that the worker doesn't get the whole product, nothing follows from that. Because you have to ask about the return to the people who supply the other factors that are involved in the creation. You have to, at that point, say, well, there's all these different things involved. None of them get the whole. And so, the worker doesn't get the whole. The suppliers of the other things, I can deal with that if we need to.
But
they
what does
don't
the
get the
supplier
whole.
of the other things mean? Are you talking about other workers, or are you talking about nature? If you're talking about nature, there's no being.
I'm talking about those who own paper clips, those who own electricity, just like the worker owns the labor power.
Yes, but I think that just pushes back the question, because the question about the owner of the paper clips, well, if plain argument goes through, then the owner of the paperclip concern is, that they're that they are a middleman between a group of workers who are manufacturing paper clips and another group of workers who are using those paper clips and, in use of something else. So I think that if you for the purposes of talking about the labor, you're talking about all of the laborers, the ones at the paperclip factory, the ones at the electricity plant, and also the ones at the factory. The question is, do all of those workers put together have at least at first blush, all else being equal, right to what they put together are the only people who create?
We can talk about rights, but we were going to talk about exploitation, and I think Cohen wants to deduce a conclusion concerning exploitation.
Yeah.
And, the whole idea is you would want to say exploitation, therefore it's not right. You can beg the question by saying it's not right, therefore it's exploitation, therefore it's not right.
No, I don't think Cohen is saying it's exploitation, therefore it's not right. I think that he's saying what it means to say that it's exploitation is that you're being unjustly deprived of something that you create. That's what exploitation means. I don't think there's anywhere in this essay where he even hints at thinking that it's exploitation rather than it's not right. It's rather that what we mean by saying that it's exploitation, that our use of the word exploitation to describe it is, as we agreed earlier, a normative claim in itself.
Yes. This brings me to my next problem with the plain argument, which is that at a certain point implicitly, he moves from the original definition of exploitation that he provides in the paper, which I find a little bit rough but acceptable, to a move, he moves from that to a definition of exploitation wherein only creation of the product counts as a contribution. Okay, what Cohen says originally is, under certain conditions, it is unjust exploitation to obtain something from someone without giving him anything in return. Okay, and the fact of the matter is, one can say that the worker is the only person who creates the product, and the totality of all the workers, you could say, create all of the products, but they're not the only people who contribute to the production process. And this middleman argument does not work because there are things that capitalists do that are not just middleman activities. First of all, capitalists take risks. They put their funds out there, or they put their resources, physical resources out there instead of, consuming them right now. And they take a risk that something gets produced, there's no market for it, they could lose their shirt. So there's a risk there. So they take a risk. And then also you've got the investors, like financial investors and so forth, they are abstaining from immediate consumption. Okay, so they are doing something to enable the product to be created, even if they're not the direct creators. So when you think of it in this sense, that it's not the case that exploitation is just a matter of creation, the question becomes, are you obtaining anything from, are the capitalists, let's say the producing capitalists, are they obtaining anything from the lender of funds? Yes. Okay. Are they getting anything from that person in return, right? Well, the point is, what is the investor of funds getting? If they don't get anything in return, then according to this definition of exploitation, they're being exploited. The plain argument shuts that all down by turning all of the various contributions to production, reducing it all to who creates versus who doesn't create, rather than the more general sense of who is making a contribution and are they being compensated for that contribution. Okay, that is, I think, the issue. And so I think that there's a slippage there between contributing to production and direct creation.
Do you think there's a way for this plain argument to deal with this question of factors of production?
Yeah, I do. I think that...
Other than to sort of create a moral, I don't know, what do you call it in philosophy, but like a moral imperative or something that only the people that make the product have a right to it? I mean, is there...
And it's not just factors of production, it's people involved in auxiliary things that make possible the production. And it doesn't have to be private property. The government creates the environment in which production can take place, the legal environment and so forth. So you could say the government is the only provider of security and the legal system, so the government is entitled to confiscate everything. That's the logic of this argument. Tells us that.
Well, no, it's definitely not the logic of it. There's a massive leap from saying that the government provides something that's a contribution, which might be a reason to think by parity of reasoning that it's the government is entitled to something, unlike the capitalist, and saying that the government is entitled to take everything. I mean, like what we're considering in the plain argument, and what we're considering, I think, in any account of exploitation is what's the capitalist is taking from is justified. The capitalist as opposed to the worker.
Hey, we're going to return to this conversation in just a moment, but first, as we do in every episode, we're going to take just a few minutes to hear from Anne Jacquard, Organizational Secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the organization which sponsors this podcast.
Marxist-Humanist Initiative, or MHI, aims to contribute to the transformation of this capitalist world by projecting, developing, and concretizing the philosophy of Karl Marx and its further development in the Marxist humanism articulated by Raya Dunayevskaya. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and today's many other social, political, and economic crises make this a moment to engage people in discussion of these ideas. In the U.S., we are faced with the threat of Trumpism triumphing and all-out authoritarianism extinguishing our right to carry on these discussions. Yet at the same moment, the multiracial movement for Black lives has spread to every corner of the country and the world, launching a flood of activism and new ideas that deepen the concept of freedom. MHI is dedicated to the task of proving theoretically that an alternative to capitalism is possible. We are distinguished by our economic analyses in which we do not merely assert but demonstrate that the only opposite to the current world economic system is its abolition and replacement with one not based on the production of, quote, value, close quote. Because capitalism cannot be fundamentally reformed, attempts to reform it lead to an intensification of state capitalism, not to socialism. We are not a political party, nor are we trying to lead the masses who will form their own organization and whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous actions alone are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organization in which mass movements striving for freedom lay hold of Marxist philosophy of revolution and recreate society on its basis. Our ideas and actions, as well as our structure and rules, are guided by the interests of working people and freedom movements of people of color, LGBTQ people, other minorities, women, youth, and all those around the world who are struggling for self-determination in order to freely develop their own human natures. We have no interests separate and apart from theirs. To this end, we open our website to the widest possible dialogue with people around the world. We intend to practice as well as espouse a two-way road between our organization and people outside it as essential to developing a single dialectic in the relationship of theory to practice, and as the way to assure the survival of Marxist humanism. Please join us.
Can the objections to the plain argument that we've been discussing also be raised against what Marx wrote in Capital and related works regarding capitalist exploitation? Are there other objections that can be raised against it? Obviously, your answers to these questions will depend on how you interpret what he wrote, and we expect there to be some disagreements about that, so it's likely that we'll be getting into discussion about what Marx wrote, as well as discussions of potential objections to it. Andrew, do you want to answer first?
Yeah, my objection to Cohen's plain argument is simple. It's not a valid argument. The argument does not prove that the conclusion is correct given the premises, and that's a fatal flaw since it's a deductive argument. They're supposed to be valid. Okay. In contrast, Marx's argument about exploitation is valid on the basis of a few premises, especially that living labor is the sole source of new value, and that capitalists pay for workers' labor power rather than their labor. Marx's argument as to why workers are exploited, given those premises, it goes through very easily. Given his premises, he proves his conclusion. The amount of new value created by, and only by, the workers' living labor is greater than the amount of value they receive by selling their labor power. The capitalists appropriate the remainder of the new value without paying the workers any equivalent. Hence, the workers are exploited. In other words, they contribute more value to production than they receive in return. But I think it'll be helpful if I explain why and how Marx's exploitation argument succeeds, while the plain argument and others like it fail. They actually have a few things in common. Marx's and the others both say that exploitation occurs when people are made to contribute more than they receive in return. Both of them say that workers' labor, and it alone, makes a particular contribution. And both of them say that workers receive less than they contribute. But there's a crucial difference with respect to what it is that workers' labor and it alone contributes. Marx says that the relevant contribution here is the creation of new value. The plain argument of Cohen and others like it try to say that the relevant contribution here is contributing to the creation of physical products, not value. And the plain argument fails, and every similar argument is bound to fail because workers' labor is simply not the only thing that creates physical products. Non-labor inputs, machines, electricity, are creators of physical products as well in every production process. And workers are not the only people who contribute to the creation of physical products. Non-workers, investors, entrepreneurs, governments, and so on, they contribute to the creation of physical products even though they don't directly create them. So the plain argument and similar ones are just bound to fail because they need to say that workers' labor is the exclusive source of physical products, but that's just definitely not true. So what happens is these arguments either just ignore the other inputs and the other agents, or like the plain argument, they duck and weave with equivocations and clever formulations and distract our attention from the basic facts here. In contrast, Marx's exploitation argument is about something non-physical, the creation of new value, not physical. And there are no obvious facts that immediately disqualify the premise that living labor is the sole source of new value. It may or may not ultimately prove to be correct, and so the exploitation theory that follows from Marx's premise may ultimately be shown to be correct or incorrect. But the argument is valid. The conclusion that workers are exploited by capitalists is unavoidable given this premise and a few less controversial ones. So, make a long story short, can objections be raised against Marx's exploitation theory? Yes, in the sense that lots of people can and do object to the value theory from which it flows. Whether those objections are well-founded, that's another matter. My view is that if we leave aside the objections that are just plain incorrect, the other objections out there are political and metaphysical. They're not factual, they're not logical. Lots of people recoil from the revolutionary implications of Marx's value theory. And nominalists and empiricists, they recoil from abstract objects and essences like value. But such things are not proper bases on which to dismiss scientific theories. They should be evaluated in terms of factual evidence and logic. As an example of one of the objections to Marx's value theory that's just plain incorrect, it's there in Cohen's paper, to soften us up, make us more receptive to his plain argument that's about to come. He first tries to demolish Marx's own argument as to why capitalists exploit workers. But he commits an either-or fallacy. Cohen says that Marx put forward two versions of what he calls the labor theory of value. He says there's the popular doctrine, there's the strict doctrine. The popular version's theoretically untenable, it's just crap, while the strict version, according to Cohen, actually implies that labor does not create value. So Marx's exploitation theory, which is based on the idea that labor does create value, well, that goes into the dustbin of history. Or so Cohen says. What Cohen calls the popular doctrine says that commodities' values are determined by what's called their historical cost. And the so-called strict doctrine says that their values are determined by what's called their post-production replacement cost. And Cohen presents these as the only possibilities, and he argues that Marx mixed and matched them. But they're not the only possibilities, and actually Marx didn't accept either of them. As I and others have shown, especially in chapter 6 of my book, Reclaiming Marx's Capital, Marx's actual theory was that a commodity's values is determined by its pre-production reproduction cost. And that's different from both its historical cost and its post-production replacement cost. So Marx's actual theory doesn't have the problems that the historical cost popular doctrine has. But more importantly here, in contrast to Cohen's strict doctrine, the replacement cost version, Marx's actual theory does imply that labor creates value. So Cohen's attempt to demolish Marx's exploitation theory by demolishing his value theory, that simply fails. Okay, Just let me say that I have been comparing here Marx's exploitation theory and G.A. Cohen's own plain argument, not Ben's belated attempt to salvage Cohen's conclusion 42 years later by means of a different argument. Cohen's 5-line plain argument fails because it's not valid. Its premises are just not sufficient to prove the conclusion that capitalists exploit workers. So, in an attempt to salvage Cohen's conclusion, Ben has put forward a different argument. For instance, he has added his argumentum ad David Schweikardtum about owners of inputs not being entitled to sell them instead of having them confiscated. And Ben has added his argumentum ad Rick Wolfram, the allegation that capitalists are just middlemen who skim profit but do nothing to assist the production process. I have problems with these things he's added and others, and I have problems with something crucial that he's dropped, but my point here is that Ben's additions are just not part of Cohen's own actual argument. You won't find it anywhere in his paper. So Cohen's own plain argument, invalid, dead and gone. And Ben tacitly acknowledges this fact by giving us a supplementary argument, or several, in order to try to reach the same conclusion that Cohen tried to reach. But the fact that the conclusions are the same doesn't make their arguments the same. The arguments are different. In the same way, Marx and Cohen both came to the same conclusion. Workers are exploited by capital. But their arguments are different, and Cohen clearly recognized that. Marx's argument was grounded in his value theory. Cohen's argument definitely was not. And again, Marx's argument is valid while Cohen's is not.
So, as to the question of whether my argument is different from Cohen's argument because of the points that I brought up from Richard Wolff and David Schweikart, no, I think that's just not right. So the points that I brought up from Wolff and Schweikart were responses to objections to the argument. They're not additions to the argument itself. That's a crucial distinction. So one of the premises of the argument is that only workers are creating products, but that response to the objection is not an extra premise of the argument itself. It's just a response to the objection. So the objection was about other inputs in the production process, and the point is that none of these are about contributions to the product that are not being made by workers. They're being made by workers in other firms. They're being made by workers in the public sector, but they are still being made by workers, and that is the crucial point. I think a more interesting objection is the one about entrepreneurial risk, although even there, I think the crucial point is about whether labor being organized in a way that goes through firms taking entrepreneurial risk. I think the crucial point with regard to exploitation is whether that's voluntary or involuntary. Now, I find it a little bit confusing when Andrew talks about Marx's argument being valid, because Marx, of course, does not anywhere spell out, here are all the premises of the argument. Here are the exact steps. He makes a bunch of comments that require some reconstruction. Now, if Andrew thinks that there is a version of that argument that relies on the labor theory of value, that would be a valid argument once we've done all the reconstruction, that's fine. Although I do find it a little ironic and a little odd that he's going to put so much emphasis on his preferred reconstruction of Marx's argument being valid, while saying, well, if you're adding to Cohen's argument, even adding to it in the sense of responding to objections to the premises, then that's just not Cohen's argument anymore. You don't need to go into value theory, and I think the reason has to do with an interesting tension between one of the things that Andrew said just now and one of the things that he said on the previous installment. On the previous installment, he said, yes, of course, exploitation is a normative claim. Here he said, well, all you need to establish exploitation is a gap between the value that workers are producing and then what they're getting back in wages. And I think that there is a really important gap between those two things, right? Because for the difference between what workers are producing and what they're getting back to count as a form of exploitation, which we agreed is a normative concept, then it has to be the case that they have a right to all of this value that's being produced, which in the previous discussion was objected to because like, oh, now we're bringing in fuzzy moral things to what's supposed to be. The mere existence of a gap between what's created and what's returned is clearly insufficient to be exploitation in the normative sense. I think certainly it's I think in intuitive moral terms it's clearly insufficient, and certainly in terms of reconstructing Marx's own views it's insufficient. Even in Andrew's reconstruction just now, it's not valid because we need an extra premise about how it's exploitative for workers not to get back the entirety of the value they created.
There's a few things I'd like to respond to. Have I reconstructed Marx? Yes, in the sense that, I didn't just repeat his words, but what's often called a reconstruction is somebody's free reconfiguring of what they think the person meant, rather than what they actually said. I stand by what I've said. It is what Marx said, even though maybe different words are used here or there, but Marx wrote a lot, and my point is that what I have put forward is not me. What I've put forward is Marx, and I might be right, I might be wrong. I think I'm definitely right as to what Marx was arguing. Now, let me first get to this issue of the normative implications of the charge of exploitation. What is typically meant by exploitation, and I wrote an encyclopedia entry on the concept of exploitation for the Blackwell Encyclopedia of Sociology. What's typically meant by exploitation is that somebody is made to involuntarily contribute more than they receive. Okay? Now, Marx's argument does, Cohen's argument tries to show that that's the case. Okay, now whether that's the case or not is purely dependent on facts. There's no moral issue concerning the facts. Where the moral issue comes is the labeling of this as exploitation. So you could say the workers get less than they contribute, and you could be happy with that, and you wouldn't want to call it exploitation. Others of us are not happy with that, and we do call it exploitation. But you don't need the moral premise to have the charge of exploitation. If you've defined that this is what you mean by exploitation, if this is what we mean by exploitation, then the facts of the case determine whether the relation is exploitative or not. End of story. Now, Ben was really interesting in the way he responded to this issue of what's in Cohen's argument and what he supplemented. He says, well, what he's done is provide a response to the objections. But there's a response to the objections of the type that clarifies what's there in the original statement. And then there's a response to the objection that tries to plug up holes in the original argument when they've been found. What Ben has done is to give us the second one. What he has done is not purely to explicate the meaning of the terms in the 5 lines of Cohen's plain argument.
Well, I mean, I think you're just getting wrong what I'm doing, and it's also a false dilemma. You're saying that the ways that you can respond to an objection are by trying to clarify what the person meant, and or by trying to by presenting a revised version of what they meant. But not all responses to objections need to take either of those forms. You could just say, look, here is a premise. Here's a reason that this person is giving to think this premise is wrong, which might even be a reason that the original person making the argument had never thought of, or it might be whatever. But then, like, the next question is to consider whether that reason is right. And if it's wrong, if the response shows that the original objection is just misguided, it doesn't matter whether it was in the head of the person who originally made the argument that this possible objection could be raised or how it could be answered.
Okay, first of all, what I did not do is what you're saying I'm doing, which is misinterpreting the premises. If you were clarifying the premises...
Well, I'm not saying you're misinterpreting the premises. I'm saying that you're giving a reason to think the premise is wrong, but that reason is misguided.
I'm not objecting to the premises at all. That's why I'm not just saying it's an unsound argument, I'm saying it's an invalid argument. The premises, which I do accept in Cohen's argument, are not sufficient to allow us to derive the conclusion that workers are exploited. Okay? And that logic cannot be repaired by giving us supplementary, argumentum ad.
Well, because I don't know what you're talking about. Because the only objection I heard last time to the logic of it was that there was slightly different wording used. And as I pointed out several times, the exact same wording could be used in both premises and it wouldn't change anything.
Yeah, it wouldn't change anything because there's still an equivocation.
What's the equivocation?
The equivocation is that although workers are the only people who create the product in the sense that Cohen has defined, there are other inputs that are creators. Okay, in addition, there is the issue that Cohen slips. He gives us in his definition of exploitation the idea of obtaining something or somebody contributing something. And most kinds of contributions then magically disappear in the course of this argument until we're focused solely on this issue of direct creation. Okay, there are two logical errors here, but the point that I've been trying to make now is that the reason that you get these logical errors is there's a lot of fancy footwork, and the fancy footwork is there to avoid letting us recognize the simple fact that workers, their labor is not the only input that creates physical products, and workers are not the only agents. There are investors, there are entrepreneurs, there are governments, there are other agents who contribute to the production process.
Well, that certainly sounds like a response, an objection to the premise, step 17 there, the labor is the only person who creates the product, because...
No, it's not. No,
investors aren't people?
I accept that.
I mean, I don't understand.
Investors are people. They don't create the product in the sense that Cohen has defined it. They contribute to the production process, but they are not creators of the product.
Then yeah, there are there are other inputs that are relevant, but those other inputs aren't an example of things being done by other people to contribute to creating the product that aren't done by workers. Those things are done by other groups of workers.
The sellers of the inputs make a contribution, okay, and they are compensated for that contribution. Okay, and so are you proposing that they be exploited, or are you saying it's not exploited? In any case, this is not anywhere in Cohen's argument.
Well, again, it's not anywhere in Cohen's argument because it's an objection to the claim that the laborer is the only person who contributes to the creation of the product. We can put it that way.
Right, and that's not, and Cohen does not make that argument. Okay, that's not one of Cohen's premises. And if he had made that argument, it would be a better argument. I don't know. Okay, but if that's how he had begun, okay, yeah, he would have been on much more solid ground.
The standards that you're using to say that everything you say is in Marx for the Cohen, we'd be having a very different discussion, because if the difference between creates and contributes to creating, is one that's crucial here. I mean, I think that's going to be.
It's absolutely crucial, and Cohen himself brings it up. Okay, he says to act productively, it's enough that one does something which helps to bring it about that a thing is produced, and that does not entail participating in producing it. Okay, the distinction is between productive activities and producing activities. Capitalists arguably engage in the former, but once the distinction is clear, it is evident that they do not engage in the latter. To be sure, if the capitalist is a productive non-producer, that will have a bearing on the thesis that he is an exploiter. It will be a challenge to a charge of exploitation whose premise is that he produces nothing. But it would be wrong to direct the challenge against the premise of that charge that he produces nothing. As this is generally intended, it cannot be denied. So Cohen has made this distinction between the productive kind of, or producing whatever activity that the capitalists do engage in, and what he's saying that the worker is the only one who does. And in my book here, this is on page 219, it's near the end of section 8 of Cohen's article.
I don't think that you need any sort of normative premise here about whether under capitalism, sellers of inputs should be compensated, because I don't think that's going to be relevant to the argument or to the charge of exploitation. Sure, if we're talking about the kind of fairness that we have under capitalism, this should be. But the point is, who creates products? maybe there could be a better version of the line of argument, of objection you've been making, if you really sort, you do more work to sort out the distinction that you think is relevant here and what kind of non-productive producers it is. But I think that the question should be, if the objection is that you need inputs to create products, those inputs are themselves being created by workers. And I think once you look at that bigger picture, it remains true that workers are the ones who are creating the products, and that you don't have non-workers in any position such that it's legitimate for them to slice off some of the value of what's created, given that all of the creation, direct and indirect, being done by workers.
And you won't find that anywhere in Cohen's paper, so it's a supplementary argument. So
it's not a supplementary argument. It's a response. It's a response to an objection. The guy, you say Cohen says the laborer is the only person who creates the product, and we're saying, oh, but that's not true, because also
I accept that premise.
Okay, but you think that I think so. I think the distinction that you're trying to make here between saying the laborer is the only person who creates the product, and then there are other people who are who are contributing to the creation of a product in such a way that they deserve to be compensated. I don't think that much can be rested on that distinction. Because if we redo the premise as the laborer is the only person who directly or indirectly creates the product, then that would remain true. I think there's a lot of equivocation about in your objection about what it is, how much, what kind of productive contribution would actually be relevant to the claim of exploitation. And also notice that in this entire discussion, other than my initial objection to it, we've just been letting stand the idea that creating value makes all subtractions of value exploitative in the sense that the moral term exploitation would be a reasonable way to create the gap. But every single strategy you're using to undermine the plain argument could also be used to undermine that.
Which you claim, but you haven't shown. And
well,
I don't accept. I don't.
Okay. Well,
I haven't heard an argument. I'm sorry to sound. I'm sorry to sound like one of those logic bros, but I haven't heard an argument
that creating value means that any subtraction of the value is exploitative. You haven't given us any reason to think that.
I haven't said that. I haven't said that any subtraction of value is exploitative.
Okay, so. If you haven't said that, then you haven't given an alternative argument for the claim that workers are exploited under capitalism, because the conclusion of your argument, which you equated to exploitation, was that workers are the source of value and they're not getting all of that value back. So either that itself adds up to exploitation or it doesn't. If it doesn't, then you haven't given us an argument yet for thinking that that workers are exploited, starting from the labor theory of value, and if it does, then the question, which I've given some reasons to undermine, you haven't given any reasons to believe, is why should we believe the implicit premise that creating, being the only creators of value means that you're entitled to all of the value? What about other?
Nobody has said. Nobody, at least I haven't, that the workers are entitled to all of the value. Marx said the opposite. But that the capitalist is not entitled to any of the value. Nobody said that either. Marx said
that
the surplus value is the legitimate property of the capitalist. We went through this, before.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. So, thank you, Ben, for joining us for the podcast.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Ben.
Hey, that's all the time we have for this episode of Radio Free Humanity. If you like the podcast, please do stop by Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org to listen to other episodes and to read more about these issues and others. As always, if you like the podcast, we encourage you to write to us, to comment and rate the podcast, and of course to share with all your friends and enemies.